Ever since I was a kid, I've been passionate about figuring out why human beings do the weird things that we do. And it started when I was in church as a kid, around the age of 12, and I just sat up one day and said, this is bullshit. And continued through high school when I had a great interest in the great apes and their behavior and how they were similar to our human behavior. And continued through university where I studied motivational psychology and the evolution of human behavior. I am continuing with that passion by sharing my insights into our behavior and giving people like yourself new perspectives on how to understand why we do these weird, counterproductive things we so oftentimes do. Because I think better when I write things down, and I'm not good at ad-libbing. I am writing down my thoughts, posting them to my blog at justonecynicsopinion.blogspot.com, and then reading them here. My post from today is titled, "It's Time to Deplatform the Woke Movement." Here's a little bomb I'll drop up front and come back to. I've lived in the Middle East, and I can assure you that those Islamic defense protests you heard about after cartoons appeared in the West, or after rumors of Quran burning, or any other incident of so-called blasphemy, are all, without exception, led by wannabe leaders of either the religious or political, or both, kind, to win them some media coverage and score points at home. They organize the events, pay attendees a fee, and whip up the crowd, issuing fatwas calling for the assassination of this or that target for one reason only, to build up their prestige, their fame, and power. The locals are just too busy trying to eke out a living to show up at a protest unless they're getting paid to be there, or unless it takes place as they're leaving the mosque and just happen to be in the same spot. The exceptions, of course, are the blasphemy attacks in the small villages against so-called heretics. Those are simply entertainment, like the witch burnings of old in America. The easiest button to push to manipulate human beings into rushing to their potential deaths, or at least to chanting, self-righteous shouting, rioting, and mayhem, is the nationalism button, which lights up exactly the same brain wiring as does the tribalism button or the religious button. It's the same button that American politicians use today to serve their corporate masters and preserve the promise of a rich payout at the end of their term. You keep Americans divided into right and left tribes, and they won't be able to come together and demand the reversal of Citizens United. If you grew up in a bubble, and it's all you've ever known, and you, like most of humanity, find dealing with complex issues and making sense of a lot of input to be a challenge, would you want to stay in that protective bubble or be keen to break out? I think most people vote to remain inside their bubble, sadly, because most humans are averse to doing work if they can avoid it. It takes work and discomfort to break out of a bubble. If you grew up with baby boomer grandparents and Gen X or Y parents, you are very likely a victim of hyperparenting. And I'm putting a link to my video on that subject below. So you're likely a victim of hyperparenting and the social bubble of the post-street-proofing era that helped turn kids of today into foot soldiers for the woke movement. Where did this so-called woke come from? Simple. Number one, missing children's faces began appearing on milk cartons in the 1960s, which led to the media encouraging street-proofing by parents. Two, this was followed by the 24/7 news cycle. CNN was born in 1980, which led to formerly little heard of global stories like pedophilia rings in Southeast Asia being used to fill up all that empty airtime. Number three, in 1969, Sesame Street came along and began educating kids about diversity in race and abilities, street-proofing, and recycling, and the related message of care for the planet and concern for the underprivileged everywhere. Number four, the latter infused, for obviously good reasons, the curriculum of grade schools everywhere. Number five, overall, these relatively innocuous social changes led to political correctness, becoming the reality for the entire Western world. So much so that it has become paralyzing debate and reversing, to paraphrase Brendan O'Neill of the UK, the progress made in the latter half of the 20th century, promoting racial segregation through identity politics, and the wholesale transformation of Western culture in an effort to avoid offending new immigrants. College students today grew up during the turn of the century, year 2000, when no one walked to school anymore, the internet and smartphones were ubiquitous, and they viewed the outside world through only two lenses: the internet and the classroom/supervised after-school activities. Outside of their first music concert without their parents, college is the first time outside of the social bubble that preached everyone deserves a trophy for participating, and not-so-smart kids should be made to feel as worthwhile as the geniuses are. In fact, universities today go so far as to limit the highest-scoring Asian students from enrolling, while filling quotas for students with grades below the lower limit for the rest. The notion that you can't get ahead without a degree has led to for-profit schools charging more and more for tuition and lower standards to cram ever more fee-paying customers in the doors. Competition inside the scholastic system has been dampened down. The former shared lists of how everyone scored against each other is fading away to avoid hurting poor performers' self-images. And the smart kids are holding back asking questions in class to risk offending others with their challenging inquiries. The reality is that many of these underqualified and fragile young people really do feel traumatized by the new environment they find themselves in. At home and in grade school, no one ever challenged what was the status quo. No one brought up controversial ideas or criticized their family's religion. Outside of the very real trauma of bullying, which gave the vast majority who were at the receiving end of some bullying enough experience with social pain and anxiety to be sympathetic to anyone else ever being exposed to it, this generation has had little experience with pain and conflict. As a side note, bullies are usually the 1% of the school population who are on the psychopathic spectrum and their sociopathic followers, leaving about 98% of the students to be their targets at one point or another. These students have little exposure to offense, the visceral experience of which I continue to struggle to define. Is it emotional pain, hurt? Is offense the prospect for potential social embarrassment if a criticism turns out to be proven correct? Is it anger at being challenged for believing something stupid? Is it shock at seeing something unfamiliar, like seeing a breast during breastfeeding out in public? So because these students have little exposure to so-called offense in the past, offense seems to come very easily to them. What do these students choose to do once they've left home and their safe grade school environment behind? Well, they sign up for classes that sound easy and comfortable, like women's studies and cultural heritage studies. What happens after they sign up to study disciplines that focus on groups that are or were perceived to be disadvantaged? To pass the course, they must listen to and regurgitate whatever the authority at the front of the lecture hall dictates. If that individual is deep diving into a field of study that ran out of material of substance decades ago, you can bet that, to keep their job and maintain their relevance, years ago they began to explore ways to broaden their field to include other disadvantaged groups, especially any that they feel solidarity with. So we have an entire generation of intensely protected kids, most of whose only traumatic experience to date has been bullying, who have been exposed to deeply disturbing pornography since late childhood through their teenage years, the sociological impact of which we are only beginning to guess at, whose parents and grandparents willingly, though naively by giving them smartphones and tablets, expose these children's constantly developing/pruning brain wiring to addiction in the form of computer gaming, porn, and texting at a younger age than humans have ever been addicted. These young people, not young adults, we now know that the frontal lobes, the long-term decision-making centers of the brain, only finish developing at about 25 in females and about 30 in males, and that's really when adulthood comes into play. They are at an age during which they are desperate to be welcomed as group members and are being fed a doctrine by their predominantly left-leaning professors, some of whom are virulently alt-left, that promotes everything they learned is important growing up, like everyone deserves to be free of the pain of bullying and the stigma of being singled out as less important. What impressionable young group member wannabe could resist this seductive notion? Well, we know who resists it. The most clever students, who tend to also be the most curious, the right-leaning ones, and those who are lucky enough to have exposure to professors with different points of view, like Jordan Peterson, Gad Saad, and Steven Pinker, all of whom, oddly, are Canadian. Sadly, many more students fall into the alt-left rabbit hole and blindly begin following the corrupt agenda of the alt-left professors and their henchwomen and men in the administration. When the entirely false narrative goes out that a conservative speaker is coming to speak on campus or anywhere of late, these foot soldiers of the woke movement are ordered out to protest, complete with points to shout about that usually bear no resemblance to the speaker's actual point of view. And shut them down they do, not by making any valid points, but by shouting over the sound system, pulling fire alarms, using violence, and threatening the school with prohibitive expenses for policing and or damage. In a side note that really could be a separate post, let's recognize that the hoodlums who call themselves Antifa, that is anti-fascists, are not leftists. They're young men who want to fight and burn police cars. They've sat behind a computer game for most of their lives playing combat and are desperate to finally act out. Continuing to do them the service of pretending that they have a legitimate political stance merely empowers them and sells more media ad time. Their Punch a Nazi motto is no different than the MAGA hat-wearing hoodlums who show up at the anti-Trump rallies and beat the daylights out of peaceful protesters. Why do the alt-left professors want to incite this kind of censorship? For two reasons. One, a few of them are actually so consumed by their left-leaning brain hardwiring that they experience it with a religious fervor and feel the need to cast out the money changers from their temple on campus. Number two, many of the speakers they oppose so vehemently are actually onto them, and those speakers' messages threaten the very legitimacy of their field of study. For the latter, especially in the field of feminism, they are facing an existential threat. Their efforts over the last 20-odd years have been to expand their influence and embrace more self-described disadvantaged minority groups under a new, much larger umbrella of grievance studies. The voices they are united against are the calm, rational, reasonable critics of the elevation of the oppression Olympics to a legitimate level of study and respect. Identity politics is a tool of division that only serves the power-hungry who work for the money hoarders to maintain the status quo at the expense of the 99%, and it needs to be stopped. So why do I claim that it's time to deplatform the woke movement? Because they've risen virtually unopposed and largely unchallenged in the media and in politics, protected by the blanket of political correctness that has smothered reasonable debate in the West. In fact, in Canada, their bullshit led to our naive and sadly IQ-challenged Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, to shepherd in a bill to make any Canadian's refusal to call a gender-challenged individual by the pronoun they chose to use in any given moment a federal crime. Like Jordan Peterson, I will go out of my way to make anyone feel better about the issues they face, including calling them grand poobah, should they appreciate that. But forced speech is the opposite of free speech and should not be a part of any free democratic society. Which brings me back to the so-called Islam-motivated protests in the Middle East that Western media take so seriously. The student protests on campus we are seeing today are the exact same thing. They're organized from behind the scenes by authority figures with a hidden agenda. The time has come for our silent majority of citizens of every political stripe to stand up and call out the nefarious actions of these alt-left professors and their supporters. We need diversity of thought, not polarization on university campuses. They are preparing the next generation to run our countries for the best interests of our majority, not the extreme positions of either the left, the right, or the libertarians for that matter. We let down our collective guard, and we have left the door open for power-hungry individuals and groups from far too many special interest groups with barely hidden agendas to shoehorn their way onto powerful platforms in the West. It is past time for the centrists among us to join the level-headed conservatives and the true progressive liberals and retake control of the conversation. We've seen what an excess of liberalism can do in countries like Sweden and England, in which areas of several cities have become self-walled ghettos that the police will not enter. It is time to raise our reasonable, rational voices and use data to guide public policy that is good for the majority over the long term, not special interest groups like that of the left-leaning professors on university campuses. Students require exposure to every side of the debate, but this latest generation will oppose it if society as a whole does not support the need for it and ensure that every point of view gets a voice. Thank you so much for watching. And if you got this far, that likely means you have a sincerely curious mind. And curious people tend to be high on the IQ bell curve, which makes you a member of my target audience. If you'd like to comment down below, I'd be more than happy to have an intellectual debate with you. The only thing I'd request is that before you comment, take a moment to consider whether the point you want to make is based upon well-researched facts, scientific evidence, proven effective policies, a balanced, nuanced point of view, and actual intellectual analysis that you've conducted inside your brain, or whether you're simply knee-jerk reacting to hardwiring in your brain that either leans right or leans left, or to dogma that you've been indoctrinated with by religion or someone whose views tend to reflect your brain's hardwiring. Sadly, most people can't control their brain's hardwiring very well, and this is the cause of all of the world's polarization and political battles. I'm a centrist, so I see both sides of most arguments, and I really like talking to other centrists because genuinely progressive, practical solutions come out of those discussions. Talking to hardwired folks on the left or right just leads to shouting matches and frustration. If you've watched a few of my videos and I've managed to change the way that you see the world, even just a little bit, then please consider either clicking on the PayPal link below to buy me a beer or becoming an ongoing patron by clicking on the Patreon link. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you on the other side of the camera again sometime soon. I hope you got something out of my thinking, and if you think I deserve it, please click on the thumbs up sign down below. If you'd like to watch more of my insights into what drives our sometimes peculiar behavior, please click on the links beside me to other videos I've posted. To get notified when I put something new out, click on the subscribe link below me. If you feel inclined to really help me out, do all of the above, as it helps my ranking on YouTube go up.